Well, good evening and welcome on the Graduate Academy debate, the Bolshevik Revolution, Causes, Dimensions, and Consequences. I'd like to present you Dr. Bartłomiej Gajos, who works at the Center for Totalitarian Studies of the Pileckiego Instytut. His main interests lie in the history of communism in Poland and the Communist Party apparatus. Dr. Gajos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olga, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you at our debate, which is going to be dedicated to the topic of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, its causes, dimensions, and consequences. And I'm honored to be the guest of our event, and I would like to present you our discussants this evening. The first one is Professor Frederick Corney from College of William and Mary. And Professor Corney specializes in the history of Russia, specifically in the revolutionary period through the 1920s. He is especially interested in historiography and cultural issues and historical memory and Soviet film. And our second discussant is Dr. Bartłomiej Gajos, who is a historian working at the Juliusz Mieroszewski Center of Dialog. And his main area of study is the history of the Soviet Union, especially the history policy and the Russian Revolution of 1917-1922. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Before we come to analyze and study the events of the 1917, I would like to start our discussion from the point in which we are going to analyze the roots and the causes of the Bolshevik Revolution. It's really interesting because on one hand, of course, there is this deep shadow of Marxism over us, because according to Orthodox Marxism, Bolshevik Revolution was a logical effect of the historical process. So it was it cannot be avoided. On the other hand, I have this rather provoking question: why Russia? Why, for example, not any other Eastern Central European country at that time? Maybe we could start from Professor Corney.
Sure. Well, thank you very much to the Institute for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here and talking to you. I thought your question was an interesting one, because it does, as you say, we are in the shadow of Marxism with the Bolshevik Revolution, and sometimes I think the shadow itself can limit how we look at the roots of the revolution. But I think it's a good question, because this question of why it happens in Russia when it's not supposed to happen, according to Marxist theory, is a question that really animated not just the Bolsheviks, but revolutionaries of all stripes in the period up to really from as soon as they start reading Communist Manifesto, Lenin and all other revolutionaries are talking about precisely this, which is, can we create a revolution in a country that doesn't have the things that we think it should have, such as a developed working class, capable, usually forged within a kind of an industrialized economy? And how do we get that developed working class? And the obverse of that is, what do we do with a country that is predominantly peasant? And words like backward were thrown around a lot in the discourse of the time, the late 19th, early 20th century. The peasants were backward. They were not able or capable of doing anything other than outbursts of violence against injustices. But the idea of having directed, organized, a directed organized revolution or overthrow of the Tsarist regime, the Bolsheviks especially, but other revolutionaries, really felt that this was just not possible for peasants. Therefore, you couldn't wager on the peasantry. And that was a massive dilemma for Bolsheviks about how they acted. The reason this is important to acknowledge is because at key points, they saw these presumptions about the peasantry reinforced. And at key points, it determined how they acted at certain times between 1905 and 1917. So, for example, the massacres at Chodinka Field, for example, the coronation of the Tsar, evidence for the Bolsheviks in many revolutions that the peasants were still incapable of controlled behavior. 1905, when lots of research was done to try to work out whether the peasantry are capable of anything more than what Bolsheviks called, or what social democrats and socialists called, economic demands. And the problem with economic demands is that if you satisfy economic demands, in theory, the opposition goes away. So the Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries were all looking for signs of something going beyond economic demands. If peasants were acting in a concerted way for something from the state and they got that, would they stop? 1905, what's come to be known as a revolution, was a case in point for the Bolsheviks. They really felt like the peasants had come up to a point where they were supporting the students and the workers in the factories and the strikes, but up to a point where they backed off and undercut the revolution, as the Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries saw it. And the same was with the Dumas that were set up after the 1905 revolution. The Bolsheviks talk about how they can't rely on peasant votes within these Dumas for action. So part of this comes from kind of preconceptions, a certain kind of under-administration of Russia, I think. Peasants had traditionally, they argued, blinded by religion and patriarchal values, a kind of a genuflecting before the Tsar. Whether this is true or not is irrelevant. The Bolsheviks are writing about this at the time. So they're blinded by religion. They are unable to see, in Marxist terms, the state of their own oppression, because they are missing the factors that would give them the ability to understand the nature of their oppression. For the Bolsheviks, this would come with the working class, the industrial working class, and the peasants were a problem for that reason. I'll just add to this. I don't want to go on too long because I know this is a debate, but the Bolsheviks are also a little distrustful of the kind of lumpen proletariat, the working classes and their ability to also foment a revolution for really up until 1917. Part of this is that the peasants, many of these working classes were recent emigres from recent migrants from the villages. So they still had one foot in the village, one foot in the city. So the Bolsheviks at every point, they especially Lenin, Trotsky, and others, Zinoviev, Kamenev, are all worried that when it comes into 1917 and this set of situations is in place where the Tsar looks delegitimized, weak, the war had just ravaged Russia, and they're all talking, of course, Lenin is saying this is the time we should just force capitalism, the capitalist countries, the capitalist world onto its knees and rise from the ashes of the socialist world. And Lenin is his group is the minority on that. They get into 1917, and I believe that a lot of their decisions about what they do and when they do it, we can talk more about this specifically, especially in the run-up to October 25th, November 7th, you can still see the effects of those assumptions about the people that they are, in whose name they are speaking, right? And the last thing I would add to this, and then I'll stop, I believe it's also at root of Lenin's call for an organized secret revolutionary party, rather than a mass social democratic party on the lines of what's happening in Europe. Even though these are all European revolutionaries, right? These are people who spend most of their time in the emigre centers of Europe. And so very they've imbibed Austrian social democracy, German social democracy. So you might expect them to be much more open to a kind of a mass party argument for Russia. Bring the revolutionaries up, bring the working classes and the peasants up gradually to the point where they can actually make a revolution. They do not. And Lenin, I think, out of a sort of mistrust of the peasantry in particular, and a reluctance to rely totally on some of the working class, says that the party is the vanguard. We have to have a vanguard if this revolution is going to take place in this country. So that's my sort of run up to that question.
Thank you very much. Maybe Dr. Gajos, you would like to add something to that before I get into my comments.
Yeah, sure. First off, thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be here. So Professor Corney presented a vision, or tried to sum up the writings of the Bolsheviks and try to compare their views of the situation in Russia with the reality. And indeed, if we look at Russia through Marxist and Bolshevik writings prior to 1917, it doesn't make really sense that it was actually Russia that's where the revolution happened. But I'd like to change a little bit the angle from which we are looking at it and start with an anecdote. And during the Khrushchev times, there was an anecdote which went like this, that the Supreme Council of the USSR decided to award Nicholas II. The question was why? And the answer was that Nicholas II actually created a revolutionary situation in Russia. And I do believe that we are now in the 8th month of the Russian aggression on Ukraine, and the role of individual in history, I think, has been brought to the forefront thanks to Zelensky, who is a great political leader and commander during the wartime, and Nicholas II, who was a very bad commander and very bad political leader, who did not understand the modern society that was being born in Russia on the eve of the revolution. Just to illustrate my thesis with two examples. The first one, when in 1895, Nicholas II met the Russian elites. It was a very specific context because everyone among the Russian elites expected after the reign of Alexander III that there will be some kind of liberalization of the system, that there will be some at least a little bit of participation from the society in how Russia is being ruled. However, Nicholas II left no doubt for Russian elites and said directly to them that there will be no liberalization, that he is really attached to the idea of Tsardom as it was in 17th century, and that's the first reason I see why the revolution started in Russia. The second one, I think that Nicholas II really did not understand modern policy and something what we call today public relations and creating an image of a successful politician. Professor Corney has just mentioned about Hodinka massacre, Hodinka tragedy in 1896. So what Nicholas II did afterwards? We could expect from a political leader to go and mourn people who died there. There were more than 1,000 people dead as a result of this tragedy. And instead of going to mourn the people who died there, he went to the party, to the French embassy. And it really showed that he does not care about his people. And I think it greatly contributed to the revolution, but had not the First World War broken out, there wouldn't have been a revolution, in my opinion. It was a trigger that has destroyed everything, everything that has been built for past 2 centuries, at least. In a way, Russia was governed by the Tsars, and it also greatly contributed no, I will say it in other way. I will formulate it another way. When Nicholas II was deeply convinced, particularly after the 300th anniversary of Romanovs in 1913, and after his sort of pilgrimage to the people he made at the time, the peasants are actually this electorate under which the whole edifice of Tsardom was built, and it's still valid. And after 3 years of war, the political parties, the stalemate we had on front, the lack of trust towards Nicholas II, the lack of sense that happened, that appeared in minds of Russian soldiers, who were mainly peasants, had greatly contributed to this revolutionary situation that was in turn, at first in February 1917, used by the Russian political elites to overthrow Nicholas II, and unfortunately, the new elites, the new Russia, the new government, in my opinion, did not learn a lesson from the period of Nicholas II, namely. And that's my, and here I will finish. I do think that had the provisional government ended the First World War and signed a sort of a treaty right after the provisional government came to war, there wouldn't have been the October coup. People were, the hopes were running high that after the February Revolution the war will be finished. Everybody was sorry for that, but was fed up with war, and there was no reason for people to fight against the central powers, and this was a great reason, a great issue that has been used by the Bolsheviks in the internal policy, particularly after the return of Lenin in April 1917.
It is a rather paradox situation, because Dr. Gajos described how the peasantry was discontent with the situation, how peasantry eventually became this main material for the revolution and for the general discount in Russia. On the other hand, Professor Corney mentioned about the role of the Bolshevik party and how it was important that they were prepared. And on the other hand, how also they didn't trust peasantry. So it is a very paradox situation in which the main force or the main engine of the revolution is in fact distrusted by the party that we, after all those years, we believe that was behind the revolution. So I would like to ask you, were there any other political powers who could benefit from the situation? Why the Bolsheviks? Why they were so important after all? Did they have any competition or?
Well, I don't disagree with Bartłomiej at all on this. Basically, I think the Marxist explanation that I outlined as inspiring or animating the Bolsheviks to act in certain ways was very important, because I don't think the Bolshevik party takes the form it does without those assumptions. And I don't think the October coup happens, or the October Revolution, however, and we can talk about how we want to define the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, the 1905 Revolution, because that most of my work is about how that is part of a full press effort to make sure it's understood as a revolution by the Bolsheviks after 1917. But I think that the reason that is important is because the Bolsheviks are animated by that. I don't think the Marxist interpretation is a particularly strong way of understanding, and I think Bart is getting at this as well, is a particularly good way of understanding why. I'm hesitant to use the word Russian Revolution because I think we kind of reify that term. Revolution becomes the locomotive. We're kind of using the Marxist terms in a way that I don't think really helps us illuminate what happens in Russia from the end of emancipation, 1861, which causes an imperial state to collapse almost under its own weight during the First World War, and then allows what is in the wartime period a really minority group of Lenin's Bolsheviks to take power in October, right? And again, we can talk specifically about what's happening in February and October, but what I think it only makes sense to me is to look at this in kind of in a structural way over about 30 or 40 years. So if you look at, for example, what's been called a crisis of penetration in Russia, a kind of a woeful inability to administer the country, either to really understand what's happening with the peasantry by the czars, by the czarist regime. Also, I think a lack of interest in what the peasantry actually is, the kind of heavy-handed top-down, to take the example of this crisis of penetration, a kind of heavy-handed top-down effort to administer a country which is woefully under-administered. And these efforts are then not fully carried out. So for example, if we look at emancipation, the emancipation edicts, which on paper were not perfect, but had they been followed through and not gone through the counter reforms, might have produced something more akin to a more prosperous peasant class. They don't. They create an extraordinarily impoverished peasant class, which is not an educated class by any means. This is why the peasants know that they have to wait. The Bolsheviks, for example, know they have to wager on the peasantry at some point if they're going to take over Russia, the bulk of the population. But this under-administered country, they seek to administer it by very heavy-handed top-down methods. I think this is actually a continuity with the Bolsheviks as well into the Soviet period. And I mean, there is evidence even today, right, that there's still a very woefully under-administered country in many ways, built on an ignorance of the population, of what the population actually is and what the population is capable of. And I think that these heavy-handed efforts to administer it create a certain disconnect between the population and the ruling classes. That's one thing. I think also there's a growing crisis of legitimacy that runs up through this. I don't think you can look at Hadinka Field, you can look at all of these moments, and it's very hard to actually quantify, but there is some loss of legitimacy of various power centers. And there are various power centers, right? I mean, obviously the Tsar is the one that you can look at most. If you look at the wartime delegitimization of the Tsar through Rasputin, for example, the most interesting thing about Rasputin, I think, is what the revolutionary groups and the social democrats and socialists do publicistically with him. That they use Rasputin and create a rumor mill around Rasputin and his lascivious attitudes towards the Tsarina in a way that is hard to quantify. But some work has been done on this sense that people start to look at the Tsar and his family in a different way because of this kind of scurrilous attitude towards the Tsar, right? Undermines it. Not helped when Tsar Nicholas takes over the command of the front, of course, because he's not a very good commander. That kind of stuff all adds in a way that is hard to quantify to a delegitimation of that particular power center. But at the same time, the Duma, right? The Duma, which could have been an alternative corollary power center, also finds itself delegitimized by the Tsar's proroguing of the Duma at various points when the Duma was not what it wanted to do. The provisional government, right? The provisional government that comes in after what's come to be known as the February Revolution. It is also hamstrung by the Petrograd Soviet. It's kind of, as it's been called, a dual power, right? It's hamstrung by a dual power. And both aspects, both the Soviets and the provisional government, are, I think, delegitimized by that vacuum, that power vacuum, or power stasis in a way that's going on in 1917. Again, hard to quantify, but there's a point at which I think you can make educated guesses about what the population will fight for. And if the Tsar and these other power centers, which are new power centers like nothing they've ever seen, most of the population has ever seen before, if they look at these power centers as a sense of delegitimized, illegitimate power centers, that is going to determine how they fight during the war, obviously, and the kind of government they might embrace when everything falls apart, as it does in 1917. And I think this is I think the Marxist story of this is very much a dominant story because it gets taken up by many Western intellectuals in the 1920s and 30s, right, even into the 1950s and 60s, the left especially, who look at the October Revolution as this kind of reified moment when the people take over this capitalistic Tsarist imperial state. Much more complicated than that, and much more interesting than that, I think, and along the lines of these crises of penetration, crisis of legitimacy, even a crisis of language in a sense, whether you want to call it a crisis or not. But people are, in 1917, people are walking through cities, and especially after 1917, but into the 1920s, people are walking through cities that look different. They've got different people in them. They are named differently. Their streets are named differently. They are doing different things than they would have done before 1917. And they are using different language if they want to be in this new Soviet polity, if they want to thrive in this new Soviet polity. So class language, for example, is a new language for most peasants who come in the 20th century, right? It's probably maybe the biggest achievement of the revolutionaries, that they changed the language in which Soviet Russia or Tsarist Russia and then Soviet Russia is understood. We can talk about how deeply entrenched that is, but it's undeniable the language is changing. So crisis of language, crisis of legitimacy, crisis of power, all of these things, I think, taken together, paint a very, very complicated picture of why the Tsarist regime ends, why a teetering provisional government takes over, and why the Bolsheviks take over in October 1917. That becomes the Russian Revolution. It comes more to Bart's second question, I think, which is, was a revolution or coup? We get into that because I think that gets much more into where my research is. But this is how I look at this very complicated structural set of issues.
Indeed. And yes, as you mentioned, that it leads us to another question, whether it was a real revolution or maybe it was just a coup, because it's also very fascinating when we look at the history of the events of the 1917, that we see that the Bolsheviks were not, in fact, the major power who was somehow meant to seize the power. Yes, they were one of the major Russian parties that, in fact, can we make that argument that only by coincidence they took the power or not? Or maybe it's just a bit of exaggeration? Dr. Gajos, can we just say that all historical logic led to this very point when the Bolsheviks took the power, or maybe there were some coincidence that eventually resulted in that way?
That's kind of a Marxist question. I'm not a determinist here. So no, I don't believe there was a coincidence on a certain zeitgeist that led to the rise of the Bolsheviks to power. But just to follow up a little bit what Professor Corney has just said, I think this different language is really, really important issue, and it has started to appear after the February Revolution. If you look at bookstores and what publications are being published, there are plenty of dictionaries with notions, and they are aimed at people to explain them what, for instance, a president means. What is a constitution? What is a republic? Just to explain people that the system in which they had lived until February 1917 dramatically changed, and we need new words, new notions, new explanations for the reality we are living in. And it reminds me, I think it was George Buchanan, an English ambassador in Petrograd at that time, who noted in his diary a dialogue with a soldier on the streets of Petrograd. Buchanan asked the soldier, who is going to govern after the February 1917 Russia? And the answer was the president. And Buchanan asked, who's going to be a president? And the soldier answered, the Tsar. So here you can see there are two different political milieu, I'd say, which for us they sound paradoxically, but it really grasps the essence of what is going on in Russia at the time. And that's the first thing. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that there were other parties, there were the opposition, there were more important and bigger parties at the time, such as the SR, Socialist Revolutionaries, who actually won the elections to the Constituent Assembly. But the thing is that what the Bolsheviks did particularly after Lenin came back to Petrograd, is that they stopped to support the regime which had appeared as a result of the February Revolution. Before that, you can even, if you read Pravda being published at the time, there are even articles that encourage people to celebrate the half year anniversary of the February Revolution. And they call the February Revolution, I mean the Bolsheviks, they are calling the February Revolution as their revolution. It's our own revolution. In other words, they are saying that that's the regime we are accepting, and we are willing to participate in it. And everything changes with Lenin. He came in April 1917, and he tries to convince the party that it's the right time to rise, to organize an uprising. And here I'm trying to answer your question: was it a coup? Was it a revolution? Because I would divide my answer into two parts. The first part is that if you read newspapers and read what Stalin had to say, what Lenin, Trotsky, and others had been writing at the time, they are calling it either coup, переворот, they are calling it, or they're calling it revolution, революция. They are calling it восстание, uprising. There is no one word that is some sort of reified or propagated, it's I think better to say, by them at the time, because I think, and here I'd like to refer to Professor Corney's book, the memory of the memorization of the October Revolution is not happening at the time yet. In 1917, in 1918, it happened a little bit later, and when it happens, then you have only one name, and it's going to be the October Revolution, and after Stalin, the Great Socialist October Revolution. The name went, and it's the first part of my answer to your question. So I would say that. There were different names used by the actors themselves. Second part of my answer. I think over this question hovers above a bigger question, which has been discussed by the Sovietologists after 1945, namely, did the Bolsheviks have the legitimacy to govern Russia as such? Because if you are tracking and reading the debate between Richard Pipes and Sheila Fitzpatrick, I would say it's also academic one debate, but also a political one. I mean, Pipes was a part of the Reagan administration, right? And what he wanted to say is that the Bolsheviks, having organized a coup, are not a legitimate party to govern Russia. They have no right to govern Russia. On the other hand, Sheila Fitzpatrick and others tried to convince us that they have the legitimacy, although there is no democracy, there are no free elections in Russia, but by the population of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks are treated as their own power, for which they are willing to, I don't know, for instance, die in the Second World War. So that's the political question. And sorry, and third part of my answer, I forgot. So my answer as here today as a scholar, I would say it was both. It was coup, which happened on 25th of October, and after that the revolution has started, and we can discuss it. What this revolution really means, what it has changed, because it has dramatically changed Russia. But here, yeah, I finished.
Can I respond to that? Lots of really interesting points there, I think. And no, it's not a coincidence. It's a military takeover, which then becomes, I mean, a revolution and coup are not descriptions of events. They're arguments for a particular understanding of events. And that's where the real battle is, I think. So many people very well have described how the kind of the physical assumption of power by the Military Revolution Committee that the Bolsheviks set up in September, and how the occupation of the city takes place, and how the Bolsheviks come to power in a government that is a real new fledgling government. They haven't actually taken power at that point. What they have done is stepped into a catastrophic vacuum of power, really. This is where I think Bart was talking about the role of the individual here. I think Lenin does make a huge difference. If Lenin, I think he comes across town to Smolny on October 10th, and that's when the Central Committee meets to decide for an immediate armed uprising. And he's opposed by two people, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Trotsky comes out on Lenin's side, and he carries the day, and the Military Revolutionary Committee gets in the occupation of the city. In a nuts and bolts sense, it certainly is, as they would call it, I think the phrase that I came across a lot in the newspapers is "Zyatia vlasti," the taking of power, the seizure of power, depending on how you want to translate it. But Bart's right, they are using all through this period, Vostania, Revoluция, increasingly as they get closer and closer and start talking about this seizure of power. What the Bolsheviks and even the Mensheviks, what the Bolsheviks don't use is the word zagovor. And zagovor is the closest to conspiracy. But it is used by the Mensheviks and by right-wing newspapers in 1917, and especially after October. And I would just disagree a little bit with Bart on this. I think the battle for the meaning of October as a revolution starts immediately with the first few weeks where you start seeing the newspapers engaged in a full-on war over the terms for this revolution. So the Bolsheviks come out and say, this is why it's a revoluция, and you're right, they start using revoluция a lot. They use Vostania. I think Vostania and I'll defer to Russians who would know this better than I. Vostania, I think, is a less loaded term. It's an uprising, insurgents maybe, but it's not zagovor. And the opposition are very, very consistent in their use of the term zagovor. It's an aventura, it's a zagovor, it's an adventure, it's a plot, conspiracy by a group of adventurers, avanturisti, by a group of pogromщики, by a group of putschists. They use all these terms, right? So you have this battle in the first few weeks. And I think the Bolsheviks learn a lesson from that, which is you cannot have multiple voices trying to make things mean, or at least you can, but it's much easier if you don't. So the first thing they do is they shut down the right-wing press, and then they shut down the left-wing press. So that by the mid-1918, they really have a monopoly over the means of information production, meaning production, in a sense, right? And that's where my work really, I think, came in, where what animated my work. It's very much about making these events of 1917 a revolution. What the Bolsheviks do is not just 1917 in October. They will concede that October was a taking of power of the main nodes of power in a major city. And they also concede that it's going to be really hard to keep that power. They're surprised. They have a big celebration after 100 days, celebrating the survival of the Bolshevik regime, right? I mean, they do not think, Lenin does not think it's going to last that long. Nobody does. Civil War, of course, that puts that to the side. But so they are in an intense battle over the meaning of these events. In the course of the 1920s, the battle is then, what is the scope? What is this Russian Revolution that they're inventing, in a sense? And it's not to take anything away from the reality of what happens, but they want the language to be used consistently. It has to be a revolution. We never heard hear the word Zagovor after 1921, ever. The press is gone, so they have control over the meaning. The revolution then is the big debate over exactly what does the revolution consist of. Does it include 1905? What role does February Revolution play in it? What about the July days? Were they part of this revolutionary process? So the whole construction of this revolution, this telling October, as I try to argue, is a story they're telling, which is, and the actual contours of the narrative itself are not fixed, are not firm for a while. That's why Trotsky gets into trouble with his analysis of October. He gets into awful trouble because he says, well, it really wasn't the Bolshevik Party, wasn't the party we would like to think it was at that point. And Zinoviev and Kamenev were undermining Lenin. If it hadn't been for me and Petrograd Soviet and this and the Second Congress, the revolution wouldn't have happened. The thing I'll stop on would be what really interested me about that whole process was not the narrative, the revolutionary narrative they tried to lay out, is the way they tried to inscribe that revolutionary narrative. That was a much more interesting question to me. And that, I think, creates a kind of crisis of memory and remembering in the 1920s and 30s as well in Soviet Russia. So a lot to unpack there, but it was not coincidence. The question is, it's a valorization of power to say they took power. Even Lenin would say, I'm not sure what power that's been taken here. It's a question of how do we hold on to this? And then about 2 or 3 years later, in 1921, after the Civil War, he's saying, okay, now comes the hard bit. We've done the revolutionary work. How do we create a revolutionary state when it's in the quotidian of everyday life, when it's boring? How do we do that when it's boring? And that was what really animated him, I think, in the last couple of years of his life. But so nothing to really disagree with Bart here, but not a coincidence. Oh, and one last thing, it's both revolution and coup. Because a revolution and a coup are not terms of description, they're terms arguing for a particular understanding of the events. The coup narrative dies in Russia to all intents and purposes in the course of the 20s. Once the press has been closed down, and there is some opposition, but even the oppositionists aren't really talking about this as a coup. But it is sustained in the emigration with the hundreds of thousands of people, of emigres who go in and they create a kind of cottage industry. Andrei Liebig has written a wonderful book called From the Other Shore, where he talks about the way in which Mensheviks especially, who are amongst the most vocal of the emigres in the emigre centers of Paris, Berlin and Paris, how they helped really stamp the vocabulary that we use to look at Soviet Russia. Gulag, totalitarianism, these kind of terms really became common use because of the influence of these emigres on academia, especially in the States, and especially in the post-war period, and on politics as well, European politics and how they looked at Soviet Russia.
It's really important what you mentioned, and I'm going to elaborate on that later, especially on the topic how Bolsheviks themselves, how they perceived the events of the 1917 and what was the meaning, especially in the 1920s and the 1930s, because as you mentioned before, the problem was, okay, we took the power, but what should we do with that? Because there is this paradox itself between seizing power through the revolution and then building a revolutionary state. But the state, of course, requires hierarchy and some sort of calming down the situation. It's really hard to manage day-to-day affairs by advertising the revolution mood and atmosphere. But we will come to that later. But it's really important what you mentioned about this dual perception of revolution, that it was both coup and revolution. And I would like to ask you how it was perceived in the West, because it created a whole new situation, because Russia was, of course, a country involved in the First World War. And Russia had obviously its own business ties with the other countries. There were some businesses, investments, and of course, Russia was a huge geopolitical part of Europe at the time, and Asia, of course. So how it was this situation perceived in the West? Because on the one hand, we have this situation that Russia was a threat to the West, because that was one of the main goals of the revolution, to spread it. But it cannot last only in one country. It has to be enlarged to the other part of the continent. On the other hand, in a daily political basis, Russia was a country with which other countries had to establish some sort of political and diplomatic relations. So how this mixture of very different approaches was solved? How it was handled by the diplomacy in the West?
Me or professor?
Whoever wants to take the first shot.
Okay, so I'll start. So I do recall a quote from Thomas Woodrow Wilson, who at the very beginning, having learned about the October Revolution or October coup, he was kind of sympathetic to the whole situation, but after a couple of days, he changed his mind, having learned about the atrocities caused by the Bolsheviks. He called the whole system created by them as being a negation everything that is American, in a way that it's not a democracy, as a system being built on violence, and there is no way that we will negotiate with it. And I think this feeling was mutual, because on the other side, I do recall that it was Leo Trotsky who, on the occasion of the first anniversary of the October Revolution, sent a telegram to Kamieniev, encouraging him to prepare images of Wilson that would be burned on public squares in whole Russia, and we should broadcast through the radio about those events, so as to make a great impression on American Svoboch. Sorry that's the direct quote. So the West reacted in a way that they have supported the whites. They have supported the sort of former system, and for obvious reasons. I mean, Russia, they wanted Russia to be in the war, that still lasted. It wasn't finished in October 1917, and the Brest Treaty was a great shock for the West, as it really undermined their war efforts on the Western Front. So in this way, I would say that there was mutual. Well, distrust is a small word, but I think there was a mutual first, I think lack of understanding of each other. Still, there was still, I mean, it was not as if we are today, and we can track and read news from Ukraine and what's going on in Russia on a daily basis, in almost every second and every minute. But still, they were still learning each other, and for sure, the West knew less about the Bolsheviks than the Bolsheviks knew about the West. That's for sure. And it all greatly influenced first of all, the politics of the Kremlin, of the Bolsheviks. They did really believe that they know the West very well, having read plenty of Marxist books about the workers' class, particularly in Germany, where they believe there will be a revolution, next revolution. But on the other hand, the West has just started to learn what the Bolsheviks really are, and for this period, for this beginning, for this first years of the Bolshevik power. There was a great distrust, and only in middle of the 1920s they have started to organize some sort of diplomatic missions and establish diplomatic relations with Moscow.
Yeah, I like that phrase. What was the West knew? What did you say? The West knew less about the Bolsheviks than the Bolsheviks knew about the West. I think that's very true. I mean, the Bolsheviks and most social democrats have spent a huge amount of time in the West. That's where they learned. They study the needs of Austrian and German social democrats. You had talked earlier about some of these pamphlets in Russia in 1917 talking about what is I can't remember what the ones you laid out were, but there are a whole bunch of others of the Bolsheviks, and one of the ones that I came across was что такое большевик, что такое коммунист, что такое социал-демократ. These are intended for the local population, but you could equally apply them to the West, because depending on what we mean by the West, if we're talking about Western governments, imperial Western governments, to use a kind of Leninist term, right? Some of which have collapsed, obviously, after the First World War. Britain is not one of them yet. That will come after the Second World War. But they look at the Bolshevik government in all of their ignorance, in a sense, because they don't really understand this Bolshevik government. This is the French Revolution to the crown, right? In a sense, in the early 19th century. This is the Bolshevik Revolution, if that's what you want to call it, to imperial states. It's in the face of imperial states. They're not going to play by the rules. Remember Trotsky's first, I think, statement when he takes over as foreign minister is, we're going to publish all the secret treaties, the ones that led to the First World War, and we're going to shut up shop. They're not going to play by the games. So it's not surprising that the West sends troops into early Soviet Russia and helps fuel, in a minor way, I think, but helps fuel the Civil War. Civil War isn't really about intervention, but it is partly. So the West looks very askance at what's happening in Bolshevik Russia. They have no time for it, no truck for it. It seems to spell only danger for them and for their survival. The very vocal social democratic and socialist groups within Western countries, especially in Europe, and to a lesser extent in America, the communists, partly, John Reed is one of these, right? They look at what's happening in Bolshevik Russia as the savior state. They buy it, hook, line, and sinker. And maybe in a sense, they're right? This is a radically different alternative in all its brutality and open class conflict and exclusionary politics. But Lenin doesn't hide this. He said, this is a dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a proletarian democracy. This is not your bourgeois democracy that you're used to seeing, right? So whether you agree this or not, this is what the kind of rhetoric they're using. So the West, the left on the West, look at Bolshevik Russia with some degree of interest and fascination. I mean, John Reed actually, with his wife, Louise Bryant, who actually writes in some ways more interesting stuff than John Reed does, but he goes to watch the revolution. And that's what he wants. He's totally imbued in this rhetoric. And he goes to watch the revolution and writes probably one of the best dramatizations of telling October, and to put it in terms I've used, of anybody. It is a full-throated embrace of this revolutionary moment as he sees it. Louise Bryant is much more circumspect in her words. I think she wrote one called 6 Months in Bolshevik Russia or something like that. It's much more circumspect. Very interesting to see. So the Bolsheviks are in a state of isolation. They are forced to step back from their kind of maximalist war communist policies because the country is starving. And they move over to this kind of new economic policy, a kind of mixed socialist and some capitalist elements in it. But it's never really put fully into effect. I mean, it does enough to help the country recover. And then the next 4 or 5 years, up to about 26, 27, are trying to get recognition from the Bolsheviks. They're trying to get the Western powers to recognize the Bolsheviks as a legitimate government, right? Which they do eventually. But the other big effect on foreign policy is that the Nazis in Germany really start to use the Bolshevik regime and communism as a foil by which to shape their own Nazism, I think, in the late 1920s and especially into the 1930s. So it's a profound effect on the state of the European political system in a way. Yeah.
Yes, and I think we are running to our second part, but before that, I would like to ask you the last question in the first part, because it's really fascinating when we look at the legacy and the heritage of the revolution, because on one hand, we have this image of popular upheaval, that the masses arose and overthrow the Tsar and establish a new popular regime, the dictature of proletariat. But on the other hand, we have all this Trotsky narrative about the betrayed revolution and how bureaucracy took the power eventually. So I wonder to what extent those two images were interacting between each other in the 1920s and 1930s, where the memory of the revolution was still vivid. And so it's really curious to find out how the situation was managed by the party. And of course, in the background, we have this problem of which we talked before, that the state has to run its own day-to-day business as usual. So the mood, the atmosphere of the revolution, it has to be somehow diminished.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start this time from Professor Corney.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, you talked in some of your questions to us about the kind of the continuities from the Tsars to the Bolshevik regime, and this might be one of them, right? This kind of, what I talked about, the crisis of penetration, this, the bureaucracy, this often disconnected bureaucratization that I think really hamstrings ties the hands of the Tsar's government in fundamental ways through the last 30, 40 years of its existence. And while the bureaucracy under Soviet Russia, is a different beast, it's populated by different people. These are often poorly educated, but they are educated in a particular different idiom in the course of the 1920s with these Komakadini, the communist academies, communist universities. So the bureaucracies look different. What Trotsky sees is essentially the same kind of foot dragging and inability to get things done, this bureaucratism, right? And the substitution is, I forget what the exact quote is, but the substitution of the masses with an ever smaller group of people, the Central Committee, I forget exactly what it is. And that for him is one of the big problems of Soviet Russia, that this is this bureaucratization is taken away exactly from what he sees as the thing to keep from the revolution. This kind of, I talk in my book about the spectacles of 1920, the mass spectacles. A lot of other things going on in the early 1920s to try and get people to reimagine their experiences in 17 and afterwards as part of this revolutionary process. And there's all sorts of ways they use it to do it. But for Trotsky, the bureaucratization, this cementing of a kind of privileged, albeit different looking class of bureaucrats, is going to hold that all back. And that, along with what I was saying before, the lessons of October, where his lessons of October are not what the Bolsheviks want to hear. And what this triggers is a full-throated, not a spontaneous, I don't think there's anything spontaneous about this condemnation of Trotsky's Lessons of October, this piece that is the introduction to his collected volumes in 1924. This isn't a full-throated, spontaneous outcry against this. This is a top-down, state-driven, I believe, marshalling of resources to take his argument apart piece by piece. And I think people have different parts that they have to write. And my second book was about precisely it. It was a polemic, and it was an organized polemic. And it's the beginning of the end for Trotsky. He is anathema because he has broached this issue of revolutionary, everyday enthusiasm and the stultifying bureaucracy of actually running a revolutionary state. And you see Stalin tries to bring this, to reactivate this social activism in the war for obvious reasons. Gorbachev in 1987 tries to bring this in his speech, his first really big policy speech, where he talks exactly about this. He tries to, he says, basically, we've got to get back. We are in this kind of zastoy, this stagnated, bureaucratized place. If anybody who's been to Russia in the 80s, in the 70s, or into the 80s, knows what this bureaucratic stultification was like, this zastoy. And Trotsky and Gorbachev says, we've got to reactivate that revolutionary enthusiasm, that social activism. That's where it's going to be. At the same time, he also gives, he knocks Trotsky. He says, wasn't Trotsky, he got it all wrong. So he doesn't go he can't go the whole way of abandoning the revolutionary project. And he tries to take that bit of it, but it's that bit of it that Trotsky was really trying to get at. That's what we're going to lose if we're not careful by this over-bureaucratization. And by what comes with that, the falsification, as he said, the falsification of the past. Falsificatia is the word he uses.
I have a quote. I have two quotes that I prepared particularly for this question. And I think those two quotes greatly sum up what Professor Corney has just said. Said that they are both from Lenin, from the question of nationalities or autonomization. He wrote this piece right after the USSR was created on 30th of December 1922. And they are both about the state apparatus, the Bolshevik apparatus that was created during the revolution, during the Civil War. It is said that a united apparatus was needed. Where did that assurance come from? Did it not come from the same Russian apparatus which, as I pointed out in one of the preceding sections of my diary, we took over from Tsarism and slightly anointed with Soviet oil? So there was a fear that Lenin had that still all those changes that had been happening since 1917 actually didn't lead to the profound change of the whole system. And what he wanted to, what he was perhaps most afraid of was the great Russian chauvinism and the rebirth of great Russian chauvinism, because in the very same piece that I just quoted, he wrote, "It is quite natural that in such circumstances, the freedom to secede from the union by which we justify ourselves will be a mere scrap of paper, unable to defend the non-Russians from the onslaught of the really Russian man, the great Russian chauvinist, in substance a rascal and a tyrant, such as the typical Russian bureaucrat is. There is no doubt that the infinitesimal percentage of Soviet and Sovietized workers will drown in the tide of chauvinistic great Russian riffraff like a fly in milk." So, and I think it's really this piece, this fragment, this part that I've just quoted. It connects us with Vladimir Putin, actually, because the right to secede from the Soviet Union that was guaranteed in the Soviet constitutions is actually something that Vladimir Putin has criticized for several times, and I think it's a long-lasting consequence of the Russian Revolution that we see nowadays. If you read his speech on 21st of February 2022, in which he recognized the so-called DNR and LNR, he mentioned that it was a time bomb. I mean, this right to succeed, it was a time bomb planted under the unified Russian state. And I think that is something when I'm thinking about a legacy of the Russian Revolution, I'm just thinking right now about first off about Vladimir Putin and his take on Lenin, his take on nationalities policy, his take on Ukraine, because I think the biggest difference between Lenin and Putin is that Lenin really hated great Russian chauvinism, while Vladimir Putin is a great Russian chauvinist.
Yeah, I would just add, could I just add something to that? Because I think it's a very good point. I think that there's also the October Revolution as a revolutionary narrative inspiring post 17 Russia is really eclipsed by the war narrative that comes out of the Great Patriotic War, right? And you see that here. And I think with Putin, there's evidence of this kind of militarized rhetoric that is very much part of post-war Russia as well, post-war Soviet Russia, and kind of an animating, explanatory, mythic Russian experience during the war, which if you spend any time in Russia, and I'm sure many of you have, comes up again and again and again. Most recently, it came up with me in 2019. I was talking about, it was a celebration of D-Day, and I mentioned it to a colleague at one university I was at, and there was a tirade about how D-Day it shouldn't be called D-Day, it's called Descent in Russia. And the reason that it shouldn't be saying in the same terms is because basically Russia's role in the Eastern Front was downplayed and basically excised from history by the West. That kind of stuff, that kind of visceral reaction, it's exactly the kind of visceral reaction that the Bolsheviks are trying to get from people in the revolution in 1970 to the revolutionary narrative, right? That's exactly what they're trying to do. And that struck me as a very effective proof of that the post-war myth has been maybe even more effective than the kind of war myth has been in my own country, in Britain. And it has animated Britain for a century since the First World War, this kind of mythic war experience that somehow captures something essential about being English or being British. I think this mythic Great Patriotic War experience captures something, has been designed to capture something quite specific about being Russia in the modern world. And you see that in Putin's rhetoric as well.
Yes, and I think it's rather ironic that, for example, during the German invasion of 1941, Stalin appealed to the Russian nationalists rather than to the legacy of the revolution. He didn't call workers of the Soviet Union arise because your rights of us proletariat are endangered. No, our motherland is in danger. So it's rather irony that even after like that period of time, this haunting Russian chauvinist that Lenin was talking about, it was used as some sort of a tool to overcome German danger. So, and I think it's also not a coincidence that Vladimir Putin nowadays he refers rather to Stalin, and he criticizes Lenin whenever he can. So it's, I think it sum up somehow the legacy of the revolution in nowadays Russia, that this part of imperialism, this Soviet Union as an imperial state is appreciated. But on the other hand, this rhetoric of the Soviet Union as a part of new quality that was that arose in the 1917 it's rather neglected. But
I think the best illustration of what you're saying is in the First World War, when Lenin argues for a defeatist option, right? Basically, he argues workers of Russia and Germany have more in common than they have to fight about. That's an internationalist rhetoric, which is totally reversed in the Second World War. Right? It's gone completely. It's a nationalist, not even nationalist, it's a great Russian argument that Stalin makes. Exactly the opposite of Lenin.
And I think we can sum up with that our first part and come to the second part, which consists of the questions that are made by the audience. And we have already 2 questions, and I'm going to read them aloud. The first one is from Ms. Julita Dudek. Can we say that Lenin was a dictator? Gentlemen, would you like to take on that question?
It's an interesting question. I mean, he's a different kind of dictator than Stalin was, I think. A dictator, I'd have to understand exactly what dictator means in that situation, because he's not in power long enough really to see. I mean, he's dead by January 1924 already. He's gone through 3 years of civil war in which he certainly exhibited some of the traits of a dictator in terms of how to fight that civil war, which was extraordinarily brutal war on both sides, both the whites and the reds. The test for him would have been what he did, how he acted in the quotidian of everyday life, right? When he was trying to run the country. He certainly had no trouble banning the press, the opposition press. He certainly had no trouble exiling hundreds of thousands of people. So if that makes him a dictator, it certainly has dictatorial tendencies, that's for sure. But yeah, I'd be interested to see what Bartłomiej thinks of that.
Oh, just very briefly, I think there is one big difference. When I think of dictator, I automatically think about Stalin or Hitler, and Lenin, for me, doesn't really fit into that image if we compare Lenin with Stalin and Hitler. For one obvious reason, yes, he set the stage for the dictatorship. That we had under Stalin. But I do think that if you read the protocols of the Bolshevik Party when Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks, there were a lot of arguments and much more free discussion, let's say free discussion, than it was during the Stalin era among the Politburo. So there were disagreements, there were arguments, and they, in my opinion, they clearly show that Lenin wasn't a sort of dictator who just came on the meeting and just said what has to be done. Just to refer to his most famous book. And I think if we call him, I wouldn't have any hesitation to call him a dictator in a newspaper I don't know, interview. But if I were to write an article for an academic journal, I would just try to differentiate and think about what a dictator really is, or what do we mean by dictator, and yeah, and that's just my answer.
Yeah, I think for me the reason I'm hesitating a bit is, as I said, there's plenty of dictatorial tendencies you can find in Lenin. I mean, you're right, democratic centralism ruled. He would argue and argue and argue. But he also wasn't, he had an extraordinary sense of strong will as well, where he would often force his ideas through. So there is kind of authoritarian tendencies, I think. But you're right. I mean, the term dictator is an extraordinarily loaded term, right? And within the way that Soviet history has been studied, this idea that this kind of prosecution or defense, depending on the particular political view that many historians took of Soviet Russia. You know, I think it was Martin Mailia wrote at one point something like, your viewpoint on the legitimacy of the October Revolution will determine your viewpoint on the legitimacy of the Soviet state. And I would add to that vice versa, right? That is a kind of a polemical attitude that I don't think is a particularly good starting point for studying any country. Actually, I don't think it really helps. So that's why I kind of was a little hesitant, I think, with that. But certainly not a Hitler or Stalin, but certainly had authoritarian tendencies in the same way that the Tsar did, in the same way that Trotsky did. You know, Trotsky certainly had authoritarian tendencies.
On the other hand, I think there is a, I don't know if you can agree with me, because when I think about communists, I think about, on the one hand, this so-called collective way of ruling with Politburo, secretary, etc., etc. On the other hand, I think it was very dependent on the character of the ruler. For example, in Poland, after 1956, we had Władysław Gomułka, who was very autocratic, and he diminished all the other people in the Politburo. So essentially, he was some sort of dictator. So I'm thinking whether can we just call in that way that Lenin could manage to achieve whole tyranny and dictatorship, but in some steps he hesitated. So maybe I think this is the reason why we have all those problems with explaining whether he was not or he was. That in fact everything in the communist system of power was very blurry, and it's dependent on the individual character of the ruler.
Yeah, I mean, Lenin himself might say, yes, of course I was a dictator. You know, I'm head of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's your understanding of dictatorship, which is the problem, he would say, I think. You know, he would say, basically, this is a new system of a new polity, a new system of rule that is antithetical to what has gone on before for centuries. I think that would, not to speak for Lenin, but so I think he would say, yeah, I'm a dictator. But he wouldn't mean it in the way that we mean it. And he wouldn't be able to, because we haven't had Stalin and Hitler at that point. So.
Exactly, and I think we have another question. It's a question from Ms. Aleksandra Korzycka. Can you tell us more about the memory of the Bolshevik Revolution today? Is this even still relevant, and if so, in what ways?
Well, I've written a couple of things. I wrote my book, Telling October, on the efforts in the 1920s, the best efforts they had to inscribe the revolution at the level of a collective and personal memory. And in many ways they did this. Probably the most interesting is Wieczerowe Wspominanie, the evenings of reminiscences, which they would gather groups together and say, then somebody from Moscow, Petersburg would come in and say, okay, comrades, you were all in the Bolshevik fraction of the Social Democratic Party in your particular area, Kostroma or somewhere. Tell me about the revolution. And it would be in those terms. I have the transcripts of this. And often they would record the responses. So people would stand up and say, well, we didn't really have a Bolshevik takeover at this point. It didn't happen until March 18. So they would say, precisely, that is the revolution. You're misunderstanding what revolution is, comrades. So that kind of, now I don't see this as a kind of top-down imposition, because there's a back and forth. And I think there's a lot of literature now on how group memories form. And you hear people, you read in the transcripts, people stepping in, oh yeah, right, we were there. There were only a couple of Mensheviks in there, but we basically voted those out. So there's this sense that you could see a kind of a memory of October forming out of individual experiences, which might not have been seen as connected with Moscow or Petersburg in any way. That was part of this. As I said before, the war, and I haven't written about this, but others have, the myth of the Great Patriotic War really eclipses or subsumes maybe the October Revolutionary memory. I think it's a much more useful memory for the post-war period. It's what a lot of countries are doing, and some countries certainly aren't doing it. But it's a lot of effort is taken in the late 1950s into the 60s, especially for individual countries involved in the Second World War to write themselves in as heroic actors. This is why the resistance becomes the dominant narrative up till the late 1970s in France, for example, rather than the Vichy regime. So a lot of countries are involved in this. There is absolutely no objection, as far as I could tell, to Russia doing this in the post-war period from the Western states, from the Western European countries, or from America. In terms of today, in a piece I wrote a few years ago, I argue basically, François Furet had written of the revolution, the French Revolution, the revolution is over. And I played with the argument that the revolution is over in that terms. That there are various polling data out recently and questionnaires before the invasion of the Russian war in Ukraine. But in the last 10, 15 years, there shows that people just don't know who, they think Lenin did perestroika. They think, all kinds of absurd and ill-informed notions of Russia's past. And in that sense, other than in a small group of Russian communists, I don't see much place for the October Revolution at all. Even in '67, the 50th anniversary, you have various Westerners, foreign observers, talking about it as kind of rather fly-blown affair, a rather kind of shabby affair. It's not really kind of the effort that they put into the 1920s. So if it had any success, it was in the first few years. I'm not sure how well it was sustained. I think it was also undermined by a kind of a more hidden narrative of suppression and repression in the 1930s, and especially the show trials. I think that's also very hard to, especially when you start going after old Bolsheviks, as they did in the late 1930s. So I don't know that it lasts very long. It's for me a very interesting process to study. And as I said before, I was informed really by my own experience growing up in England, and looking back now and seeing what a very, very strong war mythicization process I was socialized into in interesting ways. It strikes me every day, most recently in the 100th anniversary of the First World War starting and ending, which was accompanied by enormous celebrations. And I should say commemorations, but it really was kind of celebrations in interesting ways. Anyway.
About the memory of the revolution today, I just would like to add that 5 years ago we had 100th anniversary of the revolution 1917, and what was striking was that the Russian elite and Vladimir Putin himself wasn't really interested in commemorating those events for obvious reasons. I mean, some we have already discussed. So first, he's not really fond of Vladimir Lenin as Russia's historical leader, whom he really criticizes whenever he can, particularly for creating Ukraine, as he mentioned several times in his speeches. So that's the first reason I do believe the October Revolution is not seen by the Kremlin today as a good occasion to celebrate. Second reason is that I think when Putin and the Russian elite looks into the Russian Revolution 1917, they are some kind of trying to find analogs with the revolutions today, and they are looking into a mirror and they are trying, and they perhaps see an Orange Revolution in Ukraine, other color revolutions, which led to toppling down the dictators like Putin today himself is. Revolution, the very word, the very notion of revolution is about empowering people, empowering masses to a certain extent. So it really bears, it has really bad associations. I'll put this way for the current Kremlin elite. And third, what was really interesting to observe the main word being promoted in 2017 was reconciliation. And if you read carefully the discussions among historians, among the committee that was created by the Kremlin at the time to prepare all the commemorations, sorry, not celebrations, commemorations. I'm quite sure it's about commemoration than celebrations. There were disagreements between those who presented, let's put it very briefly, white version, the version of October Revolution and Civil War from the whites, former immigrants, like Natalia Narocznickaja, for instance. On the other hand, you had people who were aware of some mistakes, as they called them, during the Soviet era. But on the other hand, the October Revolution, as they argued, gave us first satellites on the Earth. We won the Great Patriotic War, and so on and so forth. And this kind of argumentation was presented by the rector of MGIMO, Anatoly Torkunov. And you have also, of course, the communists, and it has demonstrated, and you have also Vladimir Medinsky, who was also very critical of the former Ministry of Culture. Right now, he's a sort of special envoy or advisor to Vladimir Putin, if I'm not mistaken. He was criticizing the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks, for having committed a lot of crimes during the Civil War and afterwards. So it's really a topic, an issue that is being discussed, and there is no agreement among the Russian elite right now, even the elite that is currently governing Russia. So this reconciliation, I think that this reconciliation has failed. If it was the political goal to achieve in 2017. But I have not. But this discussion, I think, was somehow constrained for the reasons I mentioned before. And I agree with Professor Corney that for ordinary Russians, it doesn't really matter anymore. The Great Patriotic War is the first and foremost, the most important event that is being commemorated right now, particularly in the relation to the Russian aggression on Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be surprising that the younger generation knows nothing about the October Revolution because they've never had to remember it, right? I mean, the thing is, my generation, growing up in England in the 1950s and 60s, was very much imbued with this kind of war myth all the time, and through very, I think, interesting and subtle ways, like the war movies that were made at the 50s and 60s that were the mainstay of British TV, but a whole set of rituals and commemorations as well. I would just leave on one last note the lack of irony in the way that Putin deals with Russian history, October Revolution included, right? I mean, one of the first things he did in 2000, I think it was he visited, when he was in Paris, visited the Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois emigre cemetery, right? And he's shown around by a former emigre who was, I think, I can't remember the name now, but she was quite prominent in the community, the Parisian community today. But that was a cemetery that was set up for emigres in the 1920s, I think I think it ends in 1927 when it's full, and there are about 10,000 graves there. So he's wandering around trying to pay homage to, and he talks about reconciliation, right? He says, we're all Russians, with this extraordinary lack of irony about standing, a former KGB official standing there celebrating these people that were forced out by the Bolshevik Revolution and by the Civil War. And he eventually pays homage to, and I worked this out from a photo that I saw, I went there last summer. He pays homage, the last grave he pays homage, I believe, is to the white generals. There's a particular statue, a particular monument that has the white generals, Wrangel, Yudenich, and others, Kolchak, on this. And that's the place he's going to pay homage, right? That's highly problematic and sort of understandable at the same time, right? And the other lack of irony, absence of irony, was when he and the patriarch opened up the Stina Skorby, wall of shame in honor of commemoration of those lost in the Gulag, right? I mean, just replete with such irony, considering him and the patriarch and their part in this, right? And there they are opening this without a hint of shame at the wall of shame, or the wall of grief. So yeah, irony isn't strong.
Before we are going to reach the end of the discussion, we have a time to answer to the very last question. It's from Lowell Blackman. Wonderful discussion. I would highly recommend John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, to which you alluded. May I also recommend reading the chapter on Russia under Tsar Nicholas in Philip's Bloom book, The Berigo Years. It provides an excellent overview of social history and how that 98% of the people lived pre-revolution, and evokes the old utterance, après moi le déluge. Unfortunately, Nicola was simply too deaf, blind, and intellectually challenged, it seems, to see the writing on the wall. So I think it pretty well sums up our discussion. If you would like to add something to that, please.
I think it's a fitting comment at the end, actually. I think it's a nice coda to our discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that tomorrow I'm going to Helsinki, and Helsinki is somehow connected to John Reed 10 Days That Shook the World, because there's a movie, The Reds, that was made in 1980s, and they made it in Helsinki because they couldn't go to Leningrad, of course. And they made their best to avoid screening the monument to Alexander, to the Tsar Alexander II, which is on the main Senate Square in Helsinki. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
There's a whole interesting story about how difficult it was for Warren Beatty to get that movie made in the States with American funding for that period because of hostility towards communism. It really was a kind of his own love poem to John Reed, and it took him about 10 years to raise money to do that. Much of his own involved, I believe.
I think we could finish right now because we run out of time. So thank you very much for this very interesting and entertaining discussion, and see you next time on our next Graduate Academy debate.
Thank you from me too.
Thanks. Great pleasure.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.